Hi, I'm Joy Axelson, and today we're going to look at the book of Nahum. I want to start off by looking at a YouTube clip that was created by Scott Pitts, who is staff at the SBS in Lake Lure. This clip Scott created as an introduction to this book, and I thought it was just really good and helpful information for you. So here it is. Now, we want to look at who is Nahum. The book starts out in chapter 1, verse 1 and reads, "An oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum of Elskosh." We have no idea where this place is located. It's assumed that it's located in Judah, but it's never really been found. And we actually don't know anything else about this prophet other than what he wrote in this book. When were the prophecies written or spoken? Well, a little bit of internal evidence we can see in Nahum chapter 1 verse 12. It looks like Assyria is still at the height of their power. that they're still strong. And then in Nahum chapter 2, the prophet really describes the destruction and the complete annihilation of the town of Nineveh. But it's not happened just yet. And then in Nahum chapter 3, verses 8 through 10, refers to the fall of Thebes. So now let's look at some external evidence. Well, in 663 BC, Thebes fell by the Assyrians. And then in 668 through 635 BC, this was the last great Assyrian king, and his name was Ashurbanipal. And this is when he reigned. And after he stopped reigning, then Assyria started to go down. And so it no longer had its great strength. And then the fall of Nineveh took place in 612 BC. So our conclusion, it was probably written and or spoken between 663 BC and 635 BC. So, and this happened about 100 to 150 years after Jonah. The original reader would have been during the time of Manasseh's reign or during the time or the beginning of Josiah's reign. And Manasseh reigned from 686 BC to 642, and then Josiah reigned from 640 to 609. Judah was a vassal state during the time under Assyria, but had greater freedom during the middle and the last part of Josiah's reign. So what was the situation for the original reader? Well, under Manasseh, if you remember him from the book of Kings, it's 2 Chronicles 33, 1 through 20. He was one of the worst and most evil kings of Judah. You remember he set up Baal and Asherah worship again, and he even sacrificed his sons, and he did witchcraft, and God said that he even did more evil than the nations that were before Israel came and occupied the land. So he was taken by Assyria to Babylon with a ring in his nose and hooks in his nose, and that's in 2 Chronicles 33 verse 11. But then he cried out to God and repented, and then God restored him as king back in Judah. And we see after this that he had a time of peace and that he was able to do some rebuilding in Judah. Well, then during Josiah's reign, that's in 2 Chronicles 34, he was a very godly king. And in the early part of his reign, we saw that he had reforms that purged all of the evil and all of the idolatry and the high places. He pulled down and destroyed, and he led the people to worship God. So the original reader would be sometime during the reign of Manasseh or the early part of Josiah. So the big picture of Nahum is that Assyria has greatly sinned, and they deserve the wrath and judgment of God. God will completely destroy Nineveh because of their extreme evil that they have done. But there is comfort to those in Judah, to those who trust in God, because God is going to destroy their worst enemy, and he will take care of them. There are some themes that you can look at in the book. One is God's character, especially his sovereignty over nations, and his justice. And you can also look at the sins of Nineveh. There's some other key things you can observe is words that describe God's anger. There's repeated words of like avenging and wrath, judgment, that kind of idea. And also look at the descriptions of the destruction of Nineveh and also the sins of Nineveh. So just want you just to look back again and think back again to Assyria and how cruel and evil they were, of how they had taken the kingdom of Israel into exile in 722, and how they brought in pagan people who occupied the land The book of Nineveh says in chapter 1 verse 14 that Assyria was enriched with idolatry. They were cruel and unjust and enslaved the nations. It says that in Nahum 3 verse 4. And then her merchants had stripped the nations clean. They had just taken advantage of the wealth and destroyed these nations. And that's in Nahum chapter 3 verse 16. So Nineveh was a great, majestic nation. The inner city was about 3 miles or 5 kilometers long, or about 1.5 miles or 2.5 kilometers wide. It was protected and surrounded by an 8-mile or 13-kilometer brick wall. The outer city of Nineveh was about 30 miles or 48 kilometers long and 10 miles and 16 kilometers wide. It was protected by 3 moats and 10 walls. The inner wall was about 100 feet or 30 meters high, and it was wide enough for 4 chariots to drive beside each other, so they could even have chariot races on this wall. The city had majestic palaces. It had temple canals and gardens, and there were more than 30 temples in the city to certain different gods that were filled with gold and silver. It seemed so impeccable, and it was thought to have withstand a 20-year siege. I mean, the merchants had brought huge amounts of wealth into this city. But as Nahum predicted that it would be taken in with ease in chapter 3 verse 12, so it was taken in 3 months only.